Why does a marriage vow, a promise of unity whispered in a cathedral in Poitiers in the year 1152, become the seed of a 700-year war? How can a king of England, a man who spoke French better than English and held more land in France than its own monarch, become that nation's most implacable enemy? The story of the unending conflict between England and France is not one of simple hatred. It is a story of proximity, of a family feud that consumed generations, a civil war fought between two branches of the same royal lineage that accidentally created two separate nations. It began with love, or at least with politics disguised as love, when Eleanor, the brilliant and scandal-plagued Duchess of Aquitaine, divorced King Louis VII of France and, a mere 8 weeks later, married Henry Plantagenet, Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou. When Henry ascended to the English throne 2 years later, in 1154, a geopolitical monster was born, the Angevin Empire. It stretched from the moors of Scotland to the sun-baked peaks of the Pyrenees. The King of England was now master of more than half of France, yet for those lands he was technically a vassal, sworn to kneel before the French king he so thoroughly eclipsed. Such an arrangement could never hold. It was a political absurdity, a lit fuse sputtering towards an explosion that would last for centuries. A crown is a heavy burden, but 2 crowns are a curse. The first decades were not a war of nations, for nations as we know them did not yet exist. They were a war of personalities, a bitter domestic squabble played out with armies. Henry II, a man of volcanic energy and ferocious temper, a legal reformer and a ruthless empire builder, found his match not only in his spurned rival, Louis VII, but within his own house. Louis, less a warrior and more a monk in king's clothing, fought back with the only weapon he had: intrigue. He saw the cracks in the Plantagenet family, the seething resentment Henry's sons held for their domineering father. He fanned the flames of their ambition, whispering promises of power and glory. The result was the Great Revolt of 1173, a spectacle of dynastic self-destruction. Henry the young king, Richard the Lionheart, Geoffrey of Brittany, the Devil's Brood, as their father called them, rose in rebellion, backed by French gold and French knights. What would you do if your own children drew swords against you, armed by your greatest enemy? Would you show mercy, or would you crush them to prove that a king's power is absolute? The war became a relentless grind across the fields of Normandy, Maine, and Aquitaine. It was a war of sieges, of shattered castle walls and scorched villages. Knights in gleaming mail charged through muddy fields, their banners brilliant against a grey sky, but victory was decided by engineers and sappers, by the slow, ugly work of starvation and attrition. Henry II, a military genius in his own right, fought his own flesh and blood with a terrible fury. He captured thousands of rebels, but in a gesture of calculated mercy, often released them. He could not bring himself to destroy the sons he both loved and loathed. This was his weakness. The French crown had no such sentimentality. For them, every Plantagenet son who fought his father was a victory for France. The conflict was a tapestry of betrayal. Eleanor of Aquitaine, Henry's queen, sided with her sons against her husband and was imprisoned for 16 years for her trouble. The sons betrayed each other, shifting alliances as it suited their ambitions. The chronicles of this time are not tales of noble chivalry, they are police blotters of a gangster family tearing itself apart. The Plantagenets built an empire on marriages and the Capetians on blood, but both sides knew that the crown of France was worth any mass and any war. The fighting was personal, intimate, and vicious. These men knew each other. They had feasted together, hunted together, taken crusading vows together. Now they sought to kill each other over a patch of land, a stone tower, a point of honor. When Henry the young king died of dysentery during one of his rebellions, his father was said to have grieved uncontrollably for the son who had caused him so much pain. Yet the war did not stop. It had taken on a life of its own, a logic independent of the men who fought it. It was no longer about a father's anger or a son's ambition. It was about the fundamental, unsolvable problem of the Angevin Empire. A king cannot serve another king. The sheer geographic and political weight of the English holdings in France exerted a constant pressure on the French monarchy, threatening its very existence. The Capetian kings of France had one driving goal: to expel the Plantagenets from the continent, to break their cross-channel empire, and to unite their kingdom under a single crown. The Plantagenets, for their part, would not yield an inch of land they considered their birthright. As Henry II grew old, his body racked with illness, and his spirit weary from endless war, the conflict reached its tragic climax. His two eldest sons were dead. Only Richard, the warrior, and John, the youngest and his favorite, remained. In 1189, Richard, fearing his father would name John as his heir, allied himself with the new French king, the cunning and formidable Philip II, known as Philip Augustus. Together they cornered the old king. Defeated, heartbroken, and dying, Henry asked for a list of the conspirators who had joined his son. At the very top of the list was the name of John. The final betrayal shattered him. His last words were reportedly, "Shame, shame on a conquered king." He died, and with him died the founder of the empire. His son Richard, the Lionheart, took the throne of England. A new generation had come to power, and the war, far from ending, was about to enter its most legendary and brutal phase. The family feud was over. The War of Kings was about to begin. Who would you have backed in this dynastic struggle? The aging empire builder Henry, trying to hold his legacy together, or his ambitious son Richard, willing to ally with his father's worst enemy to claim his own crown? Tell us what you think is a greater driver of history, cold ambition or fierce loyalty. Let us know in the comments below. Richard the Lionheart. The name itself is a legend, a synonym for chivalry, courage, and the crusading ideal. But the truth is more complex. He was a king who spent perhaps 6 months of his 10-year reign in England, a country he regarded primarily as a source of funds for his true passion: war. He was a brilliant general, a poet, and a ruthless politician, but he was, first and foremost, a French prince. His great enemy, Philip II Augustus of France, was his opposite in every way. Where Richard was rash and charismatic, Philip was patient, calculating, and utterly without scruple. He was no great warrior, but he was a master of strategy and diplomacy. He saw Richard not as a romantic hero, but as the single greatest obstacle to his dream of a unified France. Their rivalry would define an era, a duel between the lion and the wolf, fought for the heart of Normandy. History often presents their conflict as a clash of personalities, but it was a clash of states in the making. Richard fought to preserve his father's empire. Philip fought to build his own nation. The conflict began with an act of supreme hypocrisy. The two kings, lifelong rivals, took the cross together, vowing to put aside their differences and embark on the Third Crusade to reclaim Jerusalem. It was a hollow promise. The crusade was merely an extension of their war by other means. They quarreled in Sicily. They plotted against each other in Palestine. Richard won immortal fame at the Siege of Acre and the Battle of Arsuf, his personal bravery becoming the stuff of legend. Philip, meanwhile, seeing little glory to be won and sensing an opportunity back home, feigned illness and returned to France. His goal was simple: to dismantle the Angevin Empire while its master was thousands of miles away. He began by conspiring with Richard's treacherous younger brother John, promising him the throne in exchange for the French territories. Could you betray your own brother while he fought for a holy cause, or is all fair in the struggle for a kingdom? Philip's whispers were seductive. John, ever the opportunist, listened intently. The news of Philip's aggression reached Richard in the Holy Land. He hastily concluded a truce with Saladin and began the perilous journey home. It was a disaster. Shipwrecked, he was captured by the Duke of Austria, whom he had insulted on crusade, and handed over to the Holy Roman Emperor. The Lionheart was a prisoner. Philip could not believe his luck. He sent a message to John, "Look to yourself, the devil is loose." While England scrambled to raise the astronomical ransom for its king, Philip and John went on the offensive, seizing castles and territories across Normandy. It was a war of spies and assassins, of bribery and broken oaths. Philip Augustus didn't play by the rules of chivalry, he played to win. For him, a captured enemy king was not a brother in arms to be honored, but a piece to be removed from the board. When the ransom was finally paid and Richard was freed in 1194, he did not return to England. He went straight to France, a man possessed by a single, all-consuming desire for revenge. What followed was 5 years of relentless lightning warfare. This was Richard at his best. He was not just a warrior, he was a master of logistics, tactics, and siegecraft. He moved his army of mercenaries with incredible speed, appearing where he was least expected, retaking castle after castle. The war bled both kingdoms dry, taxes soared, every penny that could be squeezed from English merchants and French peasants went to pay for Flemish crossbowmen and Brabançon spearmen. This was no longer the feudal skirmishing of his father's day. It was professional warfare, a grim business for profit and power. The centerpiece of Richard's strategy was the construction of one of the most advanced military fortifications of its time, Château Gaillard, the Saucy Castle. Perched on a high cliff overlooking the Seine, it was a masterpiece of defensive engineering designed to be an unbreakable bastion protecting his Norman capital, Rouen. It was built in just 2 years, an astonishing feat. Richard boasted he could hold it even if its walls were made of butter. The castle was more than stone and mortar, it was a statement, a stone-carved challenge to the King of France. The war devolved into a brutal stalemate. Sieges were won and lost, fields were burned, champions met in single combat between the lines while armies watched. In one famous encounter, Richard himself, with a handful of knights, routed a much larger French force, capturing dozens of nobles. He sent a mocking message to Philip, "We have fished well today." The irony was that for all the bloodshed, the lines on the map barely changed. Richard's genius was in defense and reclamation, but he lacked the resources for a decisive blow that would crush Philip for good. Philip, for his part, was a master of attrition. He knew he could not beat Richard in a pitched battle, so he waited, probing for weaknesses, letting the enormous cost of the war drain the Angevin coffers. The great duel between the two kings was destined to be decided not by a climactic battle, but by a random act of fate. In the spring of 1199, while besieging a minor castle in the Limousin, Richard the Lionheart was struck by a crossbow bolt fired from the battlements by a boy. The wound turned gangrenous. The greatest warrior in Christendom died an ignominious death, far from any glorious battlefield. His legacy was a bankrupt kingdom and an unassailable legend. His death, however, left the most insignificant of the Plantagenets on the English throne, his brother, John. And the wolf, Philip Augustus, was waiting. John Lackland, the name given to him by his own father, a cruel joke that became a prophecy. He was a king who inherited a lion's empire but possessed the heart of a weasel. His reign would be a litany of disasters, a masterclass in how to lose a kingdom through arrogance, incompetence, and sheer bad luck. Philip Augustus, the patient predator, had spent years studying the weaknesses of the Angevin state. With Richard gone, he knew his moment had come. The intricate web of loyalties and alliances that Richard had maintained through force of personality and military prowess now unraveled. The great lords of Normandy, Anjou, and Poitou looked at their new duke, King John, and saw not a leader to follow, but a master to be challenged. Philip skillfully exploited their grievances, presenting himself not as a conqueror, but as a righteous overlord, the King of France, coming to enforce justice against his rebellious and criminal vassal. Is it better to be ruled by a brilliant tyrant who wins wars, or a foolish weakling who brings only defeat? For the barons of France, the choice was becoming clear. The collapse was swift and total. Philip declared John's continental lands forfeit and invaded Normandy. The key was Château Gaillard, Richard's supposedly impregnable fortress. In one of the most epic sieges of the Middle Ages, the French army surrounded the castle in 1203. For 6 months, the English garrison held out with incredible bravery against overwhelming odds. The French built elaborate siege works, dug mines beneath the walls, and pounded the fortress with catapults. The defenders, starving and outnumbered, fought from tower to tower, but the outcome was inevitable. In March 1204, Château Gaillard fell. Its capture was a devastating military and psychological blow. With it, the spirit of Norman resistance broke. Within months, the entire duchy, the ancestral homeland of the English kings for over a century and a half, was in Philip's hands. John, who had shown little interest in leading his armies, had lost the cornerstone of his empire without a single major battle. A kingdom built by lions was being lost by a jackal. John, however, was not finished. Humiliated and furious, he spent the next decade obsessively planning his revenge. He squeezed England dry, raising enormous sums of money through ruthless taxation, creating a powerful navy, and forging a grand international coalition against France. His plan was ambitious, a two-front war. John would lead an army into southwestern France from his remaining lands in Aquitaine, while his main ally, the Holy Roman Emperor, Otto IV, would invade from the northeast with a massive German and Flemish army. It was a bold gamble to crush Philip Augustus once and for all. In the summer of 1214, the plan was set in motion. Everything depended on a decisive victory. The fate of France and of the entire Angevin legacy hung in the balance. Philip, facing invasion from two sides, had to make a choice. He divided his forces, leading his main army himself to confront the emperor in the north. On a sweltering Sunday in July, near the bridge at Bouvines in Flanders, the two great armies met. It was one of the largest and most important battles of the entire medieval period. Tens of thousands of men, French knights, German nobles, Flemish pikemen, and Brabançon mercenaries, clashed in a brutal, chaotic melee that lasted for hours. The fighting was desperate. At one point, Philip Augustus himself was unhorsed and nearly killed, saved only by his loyal bodyguard. On the other wing, the French knights shattered the imperial cavalry. The battle turned into a rout. By evening, the Grand Coalition was destroyed. The Emperor Otto fled in disgrace. Philip Augustus had won a victory so total, so decisive, that it would reshape the map of Europe. When the news of Bouvines reached John in the south, his own campaign fell apart. He retreated in humiliation. The Angevin dream of continental power was dead, drowned in the mud of Bouvines. The battle cemented the power of the French monarchy, forged a new sense of French national identity, and directly led to another historic event, the Magna Carta in England, as John's furious barons rose up against their defeated and bankrupt king. The conflict, however, was merely dormant. The English kings never forgot their claim. Generations passed, but the memory of lost lands and wounded pride festered. A century later, a new English king, Edward III, would find a new reason to renew the war, not just for land, but for the ultimate prize, the crown of France itself. His claim, through his French mother, was legally dubious but politically explosive. The first act of this new war would take place not on land, but at sea. In 1340, off the coast of Flanders at the port of Sluys, the English fleet, using a revolutionary new weapon, annihilated the French navy. The war that would become known as the 100 Years' War had begun. The weapon that secured the victory at Sluys was simple, yet it would change the face of warfare for a century. It was the English longbow. In the hands of a trained yeoman, this 6-foot staff of yew wood could unleash up to 12 arrows a minute, a storm of steel-tipped shafts that could pierce mail armor at 200 yards. It was a weapon of the common man, a tool that in skilled hands could bring down the proudest knight. The French aristocracy, steeped in the chivalric tradition of mounted combat, despised it. They saw it as a coward's weapon, a violation of the honorable rules of war. It was a fatal miscalculation. The longbow was not just a weapon, it was a tactical system that would give English armies a devastating advantage for decades. The flower of French chivalry was about to learn a brutal lesson in the face of this technological revolution. Is it the courage of the warrior or the tool in his hand that truly wins a war? 6 years after the naval triumph at Sluys, Edward III landed in Normandy with a small professional army, a significant portion of which was composed of these deadly archers. His campaign was not one of conquest but of organized terror, a tactic known as the chevauchée. His army marched through the French countryside, avoiding fortified cities, systematically burning villages, destroying crops and looting everything of value. The goal was to demoralize the population, destroy the French king's economic base, and provoke the French army into a pitched battle on terms of Edward's own choosing. King Philip VI of France, goaded by the destruction, gathered a massive army, vastly outnumbering the English, and pursued them. In August 1346, a weary and cornered English army took up a defensive position on a gentle slope near the village of Crécy. The stage was set for one of history's most iconic battles. The French were supremely confident. Their army was a glittering host of nobles and knights, the greatest lords of the realm, supported by Genoese mercenary crossbowmen. They saw the small English force, a bedraggled collection of commoners and dismounted men-at-arms, as easy prey. They charged. It was a decision driven by arrogance and a fatal underestimation of their enemy. The French knights, impatient for glory, trampled their own crossbowmen to get to the English lines. They charged uphill into a funnel of death. The English longbowmen opened fire. The sky darkened with arrows. It was not a battle, it was an execution. The chronicler, Jean Froissart, wrote that the English arrows fell so thick it was as if it were snowing. Wave after wave of French knights charged into the storm, and wave after wave was scythed down. Horses screamed and fell, pinning their armored riders to the ground, where English foot soldiers finished them with daggers. By nightfall, the field was littered with the bodies of thousands of French nobles, including the King of Bohemia and the Duke of Lorraine. The English losses were negligible. Crécy was a cataclysm, a social and military revolution enacted in a single bloody afternoon. 10 years later, the lesson had still not been learned. At the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, the scenario repeated itself with even more devastating consequences. This time, the English army was led by Edward III's son, the formidable warrior known as Edward the Black Prince. Once again, a small English force was cornered by a much larger French army, this time led by the French king himself, John II. The Black Prince chose his ground carefully, positioning his archers behind a thick hedge. The French, believing they had learned from Crécy, decided to attack on foot. It made no difference. The longbows wrought the same horrific carnage. The French attack fell apart in chaos and panic. In the desperate fighting that followed, King John II of France was captured. The capture of a monarch was the ultimate prize in medieval warfare. France was left leaderless, its armies shattered, its nobility decimated, its king a prisoner in London. The country plunged into anarchy. The chevauchée of the Black Prince continued, burning a scar of destruction across the land. France was on the brink of complete collapse, brought low not by a mighty host, but by a handful of yeomen and their terrifying bows. This was total war, a kind of brutal efficiency the world had not seen before. Faced with such devastation, would you choose to fight an honorable but losing battle, or adopt a ruthless new tactic to survive? Tell us. Which do you believe is the more powerful weapon in war, the crushing force of the charging knight, or the disciplined lethality of the common archer? Share your choice in the comments. France was a broken kingdom. The English held a third of its territory, its king was a captive, and its people were ravaged by marauding bands of unemployed mercenaries known as the Compagnies Franches. The nation seemed to be breathing its last. A humiliating peace treaty in 1360 stripped away vast swathes of land and imposed a crippling ransom for the king. Yet the spirit of the conflict, that deep-rooted, intractable enmity, remained. A generation later, the war reignited, driven by a new English king, Henry V, a man of cold piety and ruthless ambition. He renewed the old claim to the French throne, and in 1415 he landed in France, seeking a victory that would immortalize his name. What he found was a country tearing itself apart. The French king, Charles VI, suffered from bouts of severe madness, at times believing he was made of glass. The French court was consumed by a vicious civil war between two powerful factions, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. It was into this cauldron of insanity and division that Henry V marched his army. His campaign began with a long and costly siege of Harfleur that decimated his army through battle and disease. Forced to march his weary soldiers toward the safety of English-held Calais, he was intercepted by a colossal French army near the village of Agincourt. The situation was desperate, even worse than at Crécy or Poitiers. The English were exhausted, starving, and outnumbered at least 5-1. A rain-soaked, freshly ploughed field separated the two armies. The French, once again, were certain of victory. They were so confident they placed bets on which English nobles they would capture. And once again, their arrogance led them to ruin. The narrow, muddy terrain was a death trap for their heavily armored knights. As they lumbered forward, bogged down in the thick mud, they became perfect targets for the English longbowmen. The slaughter at Agincourt was perhaps the most terrible of all. The French knights, trapped by the press of the men behind them and weighed down by their armor, were pin-cushioned with arrows or hacked to death as they lay helpless in the mire. Thousands died. The victory was so absolute, so shocking, that it seemed to be an act of God. Agincourt was a national catastrophe from which France seemed unlikely to recover. In the aftermath, Henry V conquered Normandy and, with the collaboration of the Burgundian faction, forced the mad King Charles to sign the Treaty of Troyes in 1420. This treaty disinherited the French Dauphin Charles and named Henry and his future sons as the heirs to the throne of France. The English dream had been realized. The crowns of England and France were to be united. But history has a taste for irony. Henry V, the great conqueror, died of dysentery just 2 years later, leaving his throne to his infant son, Henry VI. The war continued, with English and Burgundian armies systematically conquering what remained of Armagnac France. By 1429, the situation was hopeless. The English were besieging the strategic city of Orléans, the last major stronghold loyal to the Dauphin. Its fall would mean the end of an independent France. And then a miracle occurred. Or, if not a miracle, something history cannot quite explain. A 17-year-old peasant girl from a remote village appeared at the Dauphin's court. Her name was Joan of Arc. She claimed to hear the voices of saints who had given her a divine mission to lift the siege of Orléans, drive the English out of France, and see the Dauphin crowned as King Charles VII at the traditional site of Reims. In a state of utter desperation, the court listened. What could be a more powerful symbol of hope in a land bled dry by despair? Joan was given command of the army. Her arrival at Orléans electrified the demoralized French soldiers. She led them in a series of audacious, aggressive assaults that broke the siege in just 9 days. It was a stunning, almost unbelievable victory. From Orléans, she led a whirlwind campaign down the Loire Valley, winning battle after battle. Her tactics were simple and direct: attack. Her presence inspired a fanatical devotion in her soldiers and a new sense of purpose in the French cause. She convinced Charles to march to Reims, deep in enemy-held territory, where he was crowned king, a hugely symbolic act that legitimized his claim. Joan had, in a few short months, completely reversed the course of the war, but her fate was to be a tragic one. Captured by the Burgundians and sold to the English, she was put on trial for heresy and burned at the stake in 1431. Her death, intended to break the French spirit, instead turned her into a martyr and a national symbol. The sacrifice of the maid had saved the crown, and her spirit would fuel the reconquest that was to come. The execution of Joan of Arc did not stop the momentum she had created. It galvanized France. The war she had turned into a holy crusade for national liberation now ground on, but the strategic initiative had passed to the French. King Charles VII, once the timid King of Bourges, proved to be an able and methodical ruler. He reformed the army, created a powerful artillery train, and slowly, systematically, began to push the English back. The turning point came in 1435, when the Duke of Burgundy abandoned his English alliance and reconciled with Charles. This sealed England's fate on the continent. One by one, the great cities of France fell. Paris was retaken in 1436. Normandy, the prize of Henry V, was reconquered in 1450. The final act took place in Aquitaine, the very heartland of the old Angevin Empire, the land Eleanor had brought to Henry II 3 centuries before. At the Battle of Castillon in 1453, a French army equipped with modern artillery annihilated an English force. It was the last major battle of the 100 Years' War. Of all their vast continental possessions, only the port of Calais remained in English hands. The long war was over. The defeat was a profound shock to the English psyche. For over a century, they had known almost nothing but victory. Now they faced humiliation and the loss of an empire. The recriminations at home were bitter. The weak and ineffective rule of King Henry VI, the same king who had inherited the crown of France as an infant, collapsed. The great nobles who had lost their French estates turned on each other in a savage struggle for power. England descended into its own brutal civil war, the Wars of the Roses, a 30-year bloodbath between the houses of Lancaster and York. The conflict that had forged France now threatened to tear England apart. While English knights were killing each other in the fields of Towton and Tewkesbury, a new kind of king came to the throne in France. Louis XI was nothing like the chivalrous warriors of the past. He was ugly, paranoid, and dressed like a common merchant. He was also a political genius of unparalleled cunning, known as the Universal Spider, because of the intricate webs of conspiracy and intrigue he spun across Europe. Do you believe true power lies in the open field of battle or in the shadowy corridors of espionage and diplomacy? Louis XI despised open warfare. He saw it as expensive, unpredictable, and inefficient. He preferred to fight his wars with spies, assassins, and bags of gold. His reign marked a fundamental shift in the nature of the Anglo-French conflict. The age of grand battles was over, the age of secret war had begun. He funded the Lancastrian cause in the Wars of the Roses to keep England weak and divided. He bribed English councillors, intercepted dispatches, and sowed discord at every opportunity. His primary goal was to destroy the power of his last great rival in France, the ambitious Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy. He achieved this not by defeating Charles in battle, but by financing his enemies, the Swiss, whose disciplined armies of pikemen crushed the Burgundian knights and killed the Duke in 1477. With Burgundy's demise, the consolidation of the French state was nearly complete. Louis had achieved through cunning what his predecessors had failed to achieve through a century of war. The Spider King's methods were a dark art. He maintained a vast network of spies across the continent. He perfected the use of misinformation, planting false rumors to mislead his enemies. He was a master of diplomacy, making and breaking treaties with cynical ease. For Louis, the state was everything, and any action, no matter how treacherous, was justified if it served the interests of the French crown. This was the birth of modern raison d'etat, the cold logic of state power that would come to dominate European politics. While England was mired in its dynastic bloodletting, France was quietly becoming the most centralized and powerful monarchy in Europe. When the Wars of the Roses finally burned themselves out with the victory of Henry Tudor at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, England was a shadow of its former self, exhausted and impoverished. The dream of a continental empire was a distant memory. Yet the rivalry did not die, it simply entered a new phase. The conflict was no longer about English kings ruling France, but about containing the growing power of the French kingdom. The personal feudal conflict of the Plantagenets and Capetians had evolved into a strategic rivalry between two increasingly unified nation-states. Louis XI's son, Charles VIII, inherited a strong and stable kingdom, and his gaze turned southward to the rich and fragmented lands of Italy. In 1494, he invaded the Italian peninsula, seeking to claim the throne of Naples. This act plunged Europe into a new cycle of conflicts, the Italian Wars, which would last for over 60 years. England, now under the shrewd and cautious Henry VII, was drawn in, not as a primary combatant, but as a key player in the complex diplomatic game of alliances and counter-alliances designed to check French ambition. The battlefield had changed from the fields of Normandy to the courts of Europe, but the enemy remained the same. The Spider King's web had entangled the entire continent, and a new generation of titans was about to enter the arena. The Italian wars were a spectacle of Renaissance magnificence and unprecedented brutality. The conflict that had once been a dynastic struggle over Normandy now became a pan-European free-for-all, fought by vast mercenary armies for control of the wealthy city-states of Italy. Three colossal figures dominated this new era: Francis I of France, a flamboyant patron of the arts and a dashing warrior king; Henry VIII of England, egotistical, ruthless, and desperate to restore English prestige on the continent; and the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, the stoic and calculating ruler of a global empire that stretched from Spain to Germany to the Americas. The personal rivalry between these three monarchs defined the politics of the age. Each saw himself as the greatest prince in Christendom, and their clashing ambitions fueled a half-century of nearly continuous warfare. What drives a king more, the desire to protect his people, or the burning need to etch his own name into the pages of history? France and the Habsburg Empire of Charles V were the main belligerents, but England, under Henry VIII and his cunning minister, Cardinal Wolsey, played a crucial role as the balancer of power. Henry would ally first with one side, then the other, seeking to prevent either France or the empire from achieving total dominance. It was a dangerous and expensive game. The battlefield itself was transformed. The age of the longbow was over, replaced by the age of pike and shot. Huge squares of Swiss pikemen and German landsknechts clashed in bloody struggles of attrition, while new, more effective artillery battered down the walls of ancient cities. The Battle of Marignano in 1515 saw Francis I win a stunning victory, cementing his reputation as a great military leader. But the tide of war was fickle. 10 years later, at the Battle of Pavia, the French army was annihilated by imperial forces and Francis himself was captured. Just as at Poitiers nearly 2 centuries earlier, the King of France was a prisoner of his enemy. Amidst this carnage, the kings engaged in breathtaking displays of diplomatic theatre. The most famous of these was the Field of the Cloth of Gold in 1520. For 2 weeks, Henry VIII and Francis I met near Calais in a specially constructed temporary city of magnificent tents and pavilions. It was an orgy of conspicuous consumption, a festival of feasts, tournaments, and lavish entertainments designed to showcase the wealth and power of the two monarchs. Thousands of attendants dressed in silks and velvets interwoven with gold thread created a scene of unparalleled splendor. Henry and Francis embraced, swore eternal friendship, and competed in wrestling and archery. It was all a beautiful, expensive lie. Even as they feasted, their agents were plotting against each other. Within months of this grand display of peace, England had allied with the Emperor Charles and was once again at war with France. The Field of Gold was a perfect metaphor for the era, a glittering surface of chivalry and honor, barely concealing the cold, hard realities of power politics. The conflict was a constant drain on the treasuries of both kingdoms. Henry VIII's ambitions in Europe were ruinously expensive, forcing him to debase the currency and, eventually, to seize the immense wealth of the monasteries during the English Reformation. The war was no longer just about territory, it was about dynastic pride, national prestige, and the personal egos of kings. It was a global chess match where armies were pawns and kingdoms were the prize. The scale was immense, the stakes were higher than ever, and the outcome shaped the nascent map of modern Europe. But even as these Catholic monarchs fought for supremacy, a new and far more dangerous force was being unleashed upon the continent, the Protestant Reformation. This religious revolution would add a new, toxic ingredient to the centuries-old rivalry, transforming the political struggle into a war for the very soul of Christendom. The Age of Kings was giving way to the Age of Faith, and with it, a new and even more vicious chapter of the Long War was about to begin. You've witnessed the extravagant summit at the Field of the Cloth of Gold and the brutal reality of Pavia. When it comes to securing power, which do you think is more effective? A spectacular public display designed to awe and intimidate, or a single, decisive military victory that shatters your rival? Let us know your choice in the comments. The Reformation shattered the religious unity of Europe, creating a new and intractable source of conflict. The old dynastic and territorial disputes were now overlaid with a bitter ideological struggle between Protestantism and Catholicism. England under Henry VIII and his daughter Elizabeth I embraced the new faith, becoming the leading Protestant power. France, though it remained officially Catholic, was torn apart for decades by its own savage religious civil wars between the Catholic majority and the Protestant minority, the Huguenots. This new religious divide infused the Anglo-French rivalry with a fresh dose of poison. The conflict was no longer just about kings and their claims, it was a battle of ideas, a struggle for God himself. Could you imagine fighting a war where your enemy is not just from another country, but is condemned by your faith as a heretic, damned for all eternity? Queen Elizabeth I of England was a master of the new complex game. She played a cautious but deadly hand. Officially, she was at peace with France, but unofficially she provided covert aid, money, weapons, and volunteers to the Huguenot cause, seeking to keep her Catholic rival weak and internally divided. It was a policy of perpetual destabilization, a Cold War fought in the shadows. Her greatest fear was a strong, unified, and Catholic France allied with the other great Catholic power, Spain. To prevent this, she used every tool at her disposal: diplomacy, espionage, and a new weapon that would project English power across the globe, the privateer. These were not mere pirates, they were state-sanctioned buccaneers, the famous sea dogs, like Francis Drake and John Hawkins. With the Queen's tacit approval, they waged a relentless campaign of plunder against the treasure fleets and colonies of Spain, and they did not hesitate to attack French shipping when it suited them. The war moved from the fields of Normandy to the vast open ocean. The English, a nation of islanders, began to realize their destiny lay on the sea. Their ships were smaller, faster, and more maneuverable than the lumbering galleons of Spain or the galleys of France. Crucially, they were better armed, packed with powerful long-range cannons. This was a naval revolution as significant as the longbow had been on land. The English developed new tactics, eschewing the traditional method of grappling and boarding in favor of standing off and battering their opponents to pieces with artillery. Francis Drake's circumnavigation of the globe was not an act of exploration. It was a stupendous military and piratical raid that brought back a fortune in stolen Spanish treasure, enough to pay off England's entire national debt. These sea dogs were the vanguard of a new, aggressive English identity, one based on maritime trade, colonial expansion, and naval supremacy. The climax of this era of religious and naval warfare came in 1588. Philip II of Spain, infuriated by English piracy and Elizabeth's support for Protestant rebels in the Netherlands, assembled the greatest naval force the world had ever seen, the Spanish Armada. Its mission was to crush the English navy, invade England, depose the heretic queen, and restore Catholicism. While the Armada was Spanish, its success would have been a catastrophic blow to the Huguenot cause in France and a massive victory for the Catholic League that sought to dominate the French crown. The fate of Protestant Europe hung in the balance. The English fleet that sailed out to meet the Armada was smaller, but it was faster and better armed. In a week-long running battle up the English Channel, the Sea Dogs, led by Drake and Lord Howard of Effingham, harried the Spanish behemoth. They used their superior seamanship and gunnery to inflict serious damage, culminating in a devastating night attack with fireships that scattered the Spanish fleet at Calais. What the English cannons started, a ferocious storm, the Protestant wind, finished, wrecking the fleeing Spanish ships on the coasts of Scotland and Ireland. The defeat of the Armada was a pivotal moment in world history. It shattered the myth of Spanish invincibility, secured England's survival as a Protestant nation, and announced the arrival of a new, dominant power on the seas. For the Anglo-French conflict, it had profound implications. It ensured that England would remain a potent check on Catholic ambitions on the continent. The Long War was no longer a purely bilateral affair. It was now part of a wider ideological struggle that spanned all of Europe, fought not just by knights and kings, but by spies, propagandists, pirates, and admirals. The focus had shifted from conquering French land to controlling the sea lanes and trade routes that were becoming the lifeblood of a new global economy. The next great French monarch would have to reckon with this reality. He would have to face an England, soon to be Great Britain, that was no longer just an island, but the heart of a burgeoning maritime empire. With the religious wars finally subsiding, France entered a new golden age under the rule of its most magnificent and ambitious monarch, Louis XIV. The Sun King transformed France into the dominant political, military, and cultural power on the continent. He built the glittering palace of Versailles, centralized the state, and created the largest and most professional army in Europe. His ambition was boundless. He sought nothing less than French hegemony over the entire continent, a goal he pursued through a half-century of nearly constant warfare. The old rivalry with England, now the Kingdom of Great Britain after the union of the English and Scottish crowns in 1707, entered a new global phase. This was no longer a feudal dispute or a religious crusade. It was a cold, hard, geopolitical struggle for the mastery of Europe and the world. Great Britain, with its growing commercial wealth and its dominant navy, became the leader and paymaster of a series of grand coalitions designed for one purpose: to stop the Sun King. The conflict became a world war, the first of its kind. The battlefields were no longer confined to Flanders and Normandy. They stretched from the forests of North America to the trading posts of India. The War of the Spanish Succession, fought in the early 1700s, was a perfect example of this new global scale. At stake was the throne of Spain and its vast colonial empire. A union of France and Spain under the Bourbon dynasty would have created a superpower that would have dominated Europe for centuries. Great Britain, the Dutch Republic, and the Austrian Empire joined forces to prevent this. The war was a titanic struggle defined by immense battles and brilliant generals. On land, the Duke of Marlborough, an English military genius, led the Allied armies to a series of stunning victories over the French at Blenheim, Ramillies, and Oudenarde. These were not the chaotic brawls of the Middle Ages. They were highly organized contests between huge, disciplined armies of musket-wielding infantry maneuvering with clockwork precision. The butcher's bill was staggering, with tens of thousands of casualties in a single day's fighting. While Marlborough was winning glory in Germany and the Low Countries, another, quieter war was being fought across the oceans. British and French colonists, alongside their Native American allies, clashed in brutal frontier skirmishes in what the Americans would call Queen Anne's War. British naval squadrons blockaded French ports, strangling their trade. Privateers from both nations preyed on each other's merchant shipping. Control of the sea was now the decisive factor. The British Navy ensured that troops and supplies could be moved to the continent, while French maritime trade withered. The war became a contest of attrition, a question of which side's economy could sustain the immense cost of global conflict longer. Do you think a nation's strength is better measured by the size of its army or the reach of its navy? The Treaty of Utrecht, which ended the war in 1713, provided the answer. France was contained, but not crushed. Great Britain, however, was the clear winner. It gained strategic territories like Gibraltar and Minorca in the Mediterranean and vast tracts of land in North America, including Newfoundland and Acadia. It had successfully played its role as the offshore balancer, using its naval power and financial strength to thwart the rise of a single dominant continental power. The pattern was set for the rest of the 18th century. A series of major conflicts, the War of the Austrian Succession, the 7 Years' War, all followed the same script. France, with its powerful army, would seek to expand its influence in Europe. Great Britain, with its peerless navy, would form a coalition to oppose it, while simultaneously using the European war as an opportunity to seize French colonies overseas. The 7 Years' War from 1756 to 1763 was the apogee of this struggle. In what could be considered the true First World War, British and French forces fought in Europe, North America, the Caribbean, India, and Africa. The outcome was a resounding British victory. The Plains of Abraham in Quebec saw the defeat of the French and the conquest of Canada. In India, Robert Clive's victories secured British dominance over the subcontinent. By the end of the war, France had lost its colonial empire, and Great Britain stood as the undisputed global maritime power. The 700-year conflict had reached a new climax. The old fight for a few French duchies had morphed into a struggle for the planet itself. But the wheel of history was about to take another violent, unpredictable turn. The humiliation of France, combined with the bankruptcy brought on by these endless wars, was creating a powder keg in the heart of Paris. An explosion was coming that would not only reignite the old conflict but engulf the entire world in a new and terrifying kind of fire. Revolution. The French Revolution of 1789 was a political earthquake that shattered the old order of Europe. The overthrow of the Bourbon monarchy and the rise of a radical republican government in Paris horrified the crowned heads of the continent. For Great Britain, it presented both a terrifying threat and a familiar opportunity. The threat was ideological. The revolutionary ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity were a direct challenge to the stable, aristocratic society of Britain. But the opportunity was geopolitical. The chaos in France seemed to be a chance to cripple its ancient rival for good. Initially, Britain watched from the sidelines, but as the revolution grew more violent and expansionist, war became inevitable. In 1793, following the execution of King Louis XVI, France declared war on Great Britain. The final, most destructive act of the long conflict had begun. This was a new kind of war. It was not a war of kings fighting for territory or succession. It was a war of nations and ideologies, a total war that mobilized the entire resources of the state. France, under the revolutionary government, instituted the levée en masse, a mass conscription that created a citizen army of unprecedented size, fired by patriotic and revolutionary fervor. Great Britain, for its part, resumed its traditional role. Its navy, under brilliant commanders like Horatio Nelson, swept the seas, blockading France and protecting British trade. Its coffers, filled with the profits of a burgeoning industrial revolution, financed a series of coalitions against the French Republic. It was the whale against the elephant, the ultimate sea power against the ultimate land power. The struggle would last for more than 20 years, a relentless global conflict that would cost millions of lives. Out of the chaos and terror of the revolution, a singular figure emerged who would dominate the age: Napoleon Bonaparte. A military genius of unparalleled brilliance, he rose through the ranks of the revolutionary army to become first consul and then emperor of the French. For 15 years, he was the master of Europe. His armies, a perfect fusion of revolutionary zeal and his own tactical genius, marched from Madrid to Moscow, redrawing the map of the continent at will. He defeated the Austrians, the Prussians, and the Russians, but one enemy always remained beyond his grasp: Great Britain. Protected by the English Channel and the Royal Navy, Britain was the nation of shopkeepers that Napoleon could never conquer. It was his obsession, the center of every coalition against him, the implacable foe that funded his enemies and thwarted his ambitions at every turn. Is it the general on the field or the banker in the city who holds the true key to victory in a long war? The duel between Napoleon's land empire and Britain's sea empire reached its climax in 1805. Napoleon had assembled a massive army at Boulogne, the Army of England, poised for an invasion. All he needed was control of the Channel for a few days. To achieve this, the French and Spanish fleets were ordered to break the British blockade and concentrate their forces. On October 21st, off Cape Trafalgar, Horatio Nelson intercepted the combined fleet. In one of the most decisive naval battles in history, Nelson, at the cost of his own life, annihilated his opponents. Trafalgar ended any dream Napoleon had of invading Britain. It confirmed British naval supremacy for the next century and ensured that the war would be a long, grinding struggle of attrition. Unable to invade, Napoleon tried to strangle Britain economically with his continental system, a Europe-wide embargo on British goods. But Britain's global trade and industrial might allowed it to survive, while smuggling and resistance undermined the blockade. The beginning of the end for Napoleon was his disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812. The Grand Army was destroyed by the vast distances and the brutal Russian winter. This catastrophe emboldened the other powers of Europe to rise up against him. Britain poured money and arms into this new coalition and sent its own army under the Duke of Wellington to fight a long and bitter campaign in Spain and Portugal. In 1814, the Allies invaded France and Napoleon was forced to abdicate. But the drama was not over. He escaped from his exile on the island of Elba and returned to France for a final, desperate gamble known as the 100 Days. The fate of Europe came down to a single day and a single battle. On June 18, 1815, on a muddy field in modern-day Belgium, Napoleon's army faced a combined British, Dutch and German force under Wellington at Waterloo. It was a brutal, hard-fought battle. For hours, the French threw themselves against the stubborn British squares. The arrival of the Prussian army under Blücher late in the day tipped the balance. The French army was shattered. Napoleon's career was over. The long war, the conflict that had begun with a marriage in Poitiers in 1154, had finally, definitively ended. 701 years of near-constant warfare had concluded in the mud and cannon smoke of Waterloo. The enmity that forged nations, built and lost empires, and defined the history of the Western world was over. A new era was born, one in which these two ancient enemies would, incredibly, become allies. After centuries of bloodshed, what do you believe is the more powerful force in shaping our world? The relentless, transformative engine of war, or the quiet, difficult, and fragile work of building peace? Write your answer in the comments. Your perspective is the final word in this long history.